Hey everyone, welcome to the weekend edition of The Bullet. My name is Paul Lathrop. I'm the Deputy Director of New Media for the Second Amendment Foundation. Joining me today, I have two gentlemen joining me. I got Dan Waz. Dan, of course, is from the Loaded Mike Show, and we have Alex Ooley of the Ooley Law Offices in Indiana joining us as well. Gentlemen, thanks for coming along for the ride today.
Thanks, Paul.
Great to be with you, Paul.
Uh, as I get ready to get going here, I want to remind everybody if you want to get in on the conversation, comment on either the live Facebook or live YouTube video, or if you're watching live, and we are live on OpsLens, if you're watching live on OpsLens and you want to get in on the conversation, go ahead and tweet with the hashtag Bullet Podcast. That'll get to me right away. We'll get your comments in on the show, and we'll discuss them. And I think social media is all hooked up, so let's go ahead and let's go to our first story. It looks like the House is moving on an assault weapons ban. Getting this story off the Hill, and they write it's unclear when or if the bill would come to the floor if it passes through the Judiciary Committee, as is expected it will. The ban is wildly popular among House Democrats. It has 211 Democratic co-sponsors, but several moderates facing tough re-election contests are not on board. This reminds me of the House when the Republicans took control right after Obamacare passed. They repealed Obamacare in the House 7 or 8 times while Obama was in office. It never cleared the Senate. They may pass a assault weapons ban in the House, but as long as people keep calling the U.S. Capitol switchboard and telling their senators we don't want this, and making sure that the 15 senators that went on board with the bipartisan gun control bill that we got hear it, we won't get it nationwide through the Senate.
Yeah,
Well,
I think you're right, Paul. Obviously, it's important to keep calling the Capitol switchboard. Let your representatives know that you expect them to stand up for your gun rights, your individual liberty. Even if you've called already, call again, call multiple times. That's very important. And I think a lot of the so-called Republicans who supported the bipartisan gun control act, of course they called it something else, bipartisan Safer Communities Act, some sort of propagandish name. But I think a lot of those Republicans who supported that bill won't go along with this, at least I hope, won't go along with this assault weapons ban.
Dan, you've got a few specifics on this. I think you even had a bill number, didn't you?
yeah, this is HR 1808, I think. Yeah, HR 1808, and this, just reading through this, it reminds me very much of the New York so-called SAFE Act that was passed in the middle of the night by our disgraced ex-governor Cuomo, and the idea that they can decide what functions and features you can have on a rifle, and by way of doing that, deem it, a so-called assault weapon. In other words, if it's got a detachable magazine and a pistol grip, they want to ban it. So they get into these areas where you can have one item on your gun but not the other, and not this and not that, and limited number of rounds in your magazine. It's all a bunch of nonsense. And what it is, it's a kind of a repeat of the New York State SAFE Act. It looks like to me. I haven't read through the entire thing, but what I've read enough to see what they're trying to do. Not only that, but in 1994 we had a so-called assault weapons ban, and that was the deal with that was that it would be sunsetted 10 years later should it should it prove to not stop violence. Bill Clinton was out there saying, this is going to stop violence. Everybody was talking about stopping violence with this so-called assault weapons. Well, it sunsetted 10 years later because it did
nothing. Yes. It did absolutely nothing.
You saw in some areas, you saw violence go up. It was so ridiculous. But these Democrats just want to violate our rights and control people. That's what this is all about. One more thing, and this one goes even farther. They're talking about anything other than a revolver. Basically, it looks like anything other than a revolver or bolt action. It's just really bad, and it's just going to be a repeat of what they did before that never worked. So hopefully it doesn't pass. I think we have a chance in the Senate.
Again, and I've said this before, but each of your senators has a local office. It hasn't cleared the House yet, but if it does, and I'm fairly sure it will, when it clears the House, you need to be on not just the national switchboard, the 202-224-3121. You need to call that, but you need to call your senators' local offices in your state. All senators have multiple offices in your states. Call each of the offices in your states. And even if you're in California, even if you're in New York, you need to let them know that you do not want this to go through. There are there are estimates that north of 40% of us are gun owners. And if north of 40% of us are making phone calls to the offices, and we're making 4 and 5 phone calls, both to the national office and their home offices, it's going to sound like there's 70%, 80% of the population is calling. So we need to really be hammering on this when it moves out of the House, and I do believe it will.
And obviously, I'm from Indiana, and Todd Young, senator from Indiana, is one of the Republicans who supported the bipartisan gun control that Joe Biden recently signed into law. So if you're from Indiana, make sure you reach out to Todd Young, his office, the Capitol Switchboard, and the local office, like you were saying, Paul, because he's one of those 15 Republicans that supported the mess that was the bipartisan gun control. So make sure you reach out to him if you're from Indiana to let him know that you expect him to stand up against this so-called assault weapons ban, which, of course, is primarily targeting AR-15s, which I think will be, in light of the recent Bruin decision, will be protected by the Supreme Court in the Second Amendment because of the common use test, because AR-15s are the most popular rifle in America, and I think certainly they would meet the definition of common use. They're commonly used by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes, including self-defense. So I think that I don't think this so-called assault weapons ban will get through the Senate, likely to get through the House, but not the Senate. But even if it does, I think ultimately it would be an unconstitutional provision.
Yeah, it would be law for a minute or two. I mean, well, it would be. I know for a absolute fact that it would go to court. My boss, among others, would be taking it to court. And I don't think it would stand long, but we can't let it stand for even a minute. We need to stop it before it gets to the point where it has to go to court.
Exactly. Yeah, obviously we don't want it to get that far.
And there's another piece here that they're in the Bruin decision. Judge Thomas wrote in a thing that talks about historical balance or historical precedents, and I think anything that they pass is going to have a tough time because it's going to be hard to meet historical precedents on any of these current or future gun laws. The problem is, and what we're dealing with in New York State right now, is appointed Governor Hochul just signed into law this new package of gun bills, and now we have to hopefully get a stay or a restraining order on this because it's going into effect September 1st, because it completely violates Bruin. It violates the Constitution, and luckily we have some gun rights groups that have filed lawsuits or are in the process of that. When you said it could be law for a minute, that's true. This stuff can go into effect, and then how long will it take to fight it back and destroy these nasty laws? Who knows? That stuff takes a long time. The Bruin case started in 15. You can see it. It took 7 years to get that thing accomplished. So in the meantime, the Democrats love abusing citizens as much as they possibly can. They usually lose in court, but they have fun in the process. It's a shameful thing.
Yeah, and they part of the strategy, of course, is they know they're likely to lose in court, but nevertheless, gun rights organizations have to expend time and money and resources to protect these rights, and that's part of their strategy, is to try to drain the pocketbooks of gun companies, gun rights organizations, and folks like you and me who want to protect our individual liberty.
Well, and looking at it from, playing devil's advocate, looking at it from their side, going to court is never a 100% thing. Are they going to lose? Most likely, but it's not 100%. Why not roll the dice?
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of it's just political posturing, knowing that the bill is not likely to pass the Senate, but it might, and that they're likely to lose in court. They might not, but they're likely to. But nevertheless, it's political posturing, if nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get a comment in here real quick. Mike White. Whoops, I didn't want to do that one. I wanted to do that'll work. Mike White says all these laws do is make criminals out of law-abiding citizens. That is the general effect, because an assault weapons ban is not going to. It's rare that I'm not going to say it's non-existent, but it is rare that an AR or an AK is used in a crime. Handguns are used far, far, far more often. But by banning them, you're going to make all kinds of us, myself multiple times over, a felon. That's really all you're going to accomplish. The bad guys that have them are certainly not going to turn them in.
Didn't Stephen Williford have an AR-15?
Yes.
And he used it to save lives?
Yes.
Didn't that happen? So why aren't we creating, laws? Why aren't we respecting the fact that the majority of AR-15s are used to protect homes, protect people? The amount of AR-15s that are used to hurt people is minuscule compared to the number of times guns are used to save lives. So we know this. We know that the laws turn good people into criminals and do nothing to stop the bad guys. We know all this stuff. We have to get over that, and we have to start looking at the fact that the left is really playing a political game here. They don't care about saving lives. If they did, there's so many other things that we tell them to do that would save lives. They don't really want to save lives. This is a political game for them, and they'll use every strategy they can to justify more gun control, because ultimately they want to control the people.
That's exactly right.
Diane says, I don't trust the Republicans who voted in the last gun bill. I think half those rhinos will vote for the assault weapons ban. Diane, you do have a point. I think that Portman of Ohio, who's retiring, and I cannot remember the guy's name out of North Carolina who's retiring, I think they may be a lost cause. But just as the gun grabbers are putting these laws forward and going to court saying that it's not a 100% chance we're going to lose, I'm going to say, even if you live in these districts, call their offices. Even if you think it may do no good, it may do good. It's not a 100% chance that you're wasting your time. Call anyway. You may do some good. Yeah, and I'm with you, Diane. I wouldn't trust Portman to mow my lawn after what he's done. I wouldn't trust what's her name out of Maine, but she's not up for re-election till 26. but still, we've got to keep working on this. We've got to work like they are the R. They are the people that they have the R behind their name. They ran as Republicans. We got to treat them as Republicans until we get them out of office.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't trust many of them either. They'll have to get 10 of those Republicans, 10 of the 15 that supported the bipartisan gun control bill to pass the Senate. I'm hopeful anyway that they won't get 10 of those, but I'm certain that they will get a few of them. And going back to Mike White's point about this law simply criminalizing behavior of law-abiding citizens, that's really all it's going to do, because, like you said, Paul and Dan, criminals aren't going to give up their firearms. This is only it's going to accomplish nothing except to criminalize otherwise lawful behavior and deprive law-abiding citizens of an instrument, a tool that they use to defend themselves and their property. And so I think these assault weapons bans will accomplish nothing, and it's an example of a law that criminalizes behavior that's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with possessing these tools for self-defense. It's a law that's not wrong. That criminalizes behavior that's not wrong in itself. That is something like murder. It's called malum in se, something that's wrong in itself. It's wrong simply because it's prohibited. Malum prohibitum. And I think that these sorts of laws accomplish nothing except to hurt good people.
Let's go ahead and move on to our next story. And this has been a burr in my saddle for a very long time. As it currently sits, if you have a restraining order, you are there is, I believe the legal term is, you have an injunction against getting a fire. You have to turn your firearms in. You cannot purchase any more firearms. You immediately have to give up all your firearms until the restraining order goes away. Right now, there's a case in the Ninth Circuit, reading off of courthousenews.com. The Ninth Circuit heard oral arguments Friday in a gun rights case in California, in which an Orange County couple is trying to get their right to possess firearms back despite having a restraining order taken out against them. According to California law, a person subject to a restraining order shall not own, possess, purchase, receive, or attempt to purchase or receive a firearm or ammunition while the protective order is in effect. In this particular case, it's a neighbor dispute. Two neighbors do not like each other, got mutual protection orders, and it sounds like from reading this case, the couple, there's one of the neighbors is kind of on the nuts end. The couple that's not on the nuts end is trying to get their firearms back. A judge just said, okay, there's two restraining orders here. I'm gonna grant them both. And I'm really hoping that this couple's able to get their firearms back. I'm gonna expound just a little bit. Quite often, I'm not an attorney, so Alex, I'm going to be leaning on you here in just a second. But a judge in a restraining order, they're very they're pressured to give these simply because if they're wrong and they don't issue a restraining order, that they got to live with that, and they have to live with that for a very long time. So they're under pressure to give these things, and yet every time they issue a restraining order, they restrict someone's Second Amendment rights. I remember quite a while ago going through an interview, and the topic of divorce came up, and it's almost standard procedure when a divorce comes up, both the husband and the wife file for restraining orders, as for its common practice. It's all automatically granted. So, I just because you're going through a divorce doesn't mean you should lose your right to keep and bear arms until the whole thing's wrapped up. Alex, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna jump to you first for this one, man.
Yeah, so So this case is somewhat unique because it involves a restraining order between neighbors. Under federal law, it's 18 USC 922, which we actually discussed in some detail uh, yesterday on the show yesterday, but with respect to a different provision. Under 18 USC 922, someone who is subject to a court order restraining the person from harassing, stalking, or threatening, and this is the important part, an intimate partner or child of the intimate partner is prohibited from possessing a firearm. This case out of California does not involve an intimate partner. These are neighbors. So this is a civil restraining order between neighbors and does not involve an intimate partner, which is the prohibiting factor under federal law. So here it's interesting because it's going a step further and saying even a restraining order between non-intimate partners is a prohibition on your ability to possess a firearm. So I think that's interesting. And the other part here is that this case was filed before the Bruin decision came down, and the petitioners are asking, I believe, for the ability to amend their complaint to include a challenge to the law in California prohibiting folks from having firearms who are subject to a restraining order. And I think they've got a legitimate claim there. I think there is probably some basis in the text, history, and tradition, as we know is the standard from Bruin, to challenge these sorts of prohibitions based on restraining orders because the Heller decision and even in McDonald and in Bruin pointed out that there is some history of trying to of laws that try to prevent dangerous people from possessing firearms. But just because you're subject of a civil protection order doesn't mean you're dangerous, at least to the extent that you should be prohibited from possessing a firearm. And in the context of a divorce, like you referenced, Paul, a lot of times those restraining orders are restraint on the ability of the person to dispose of property, which is not the same necessarily as a restraint on having contact with the other person because of some sort of safety concern. So I think there needs to be some distinction that that the folks who are being restrained or who are being prohibited from possessing firearms are there's some safety concern, some danger that they pose to another person because of the facts and circumstance, not simply because of there's a divorce pending or because there's a dispute between neighbors. There needs to be something greater than that.
That's one. I'm hoping this this could what we're speaking of is generally known as the Lautenberg Amendment, and this has the potential to greatly limit that, and I'm certainly hoping it does. There, you are not convicted of anything when the Lautenberg Amendment takes effect. You've just gone to court. A judge says, "Yeah, you two probably shouldn't be around each other," and therefore you lose your Second Amendment rights. And you may or may not have done anything. There's no laws that have been broken here. So, um,
And,
I'm,
and going back to your point too, Paul, about the propensity of judges to simply grant these things because they to grant protective orders or restraining orders because they don't want to be on the hook if something bad does happen. They're inclined for the most part to simply grant them and restrain the person's ability to possess a firearm because there's no harm to the judge in doing that. There is to the person who's losing their rights, but not to the judge. And if that person does go out and hurt somebody, the judge can say, look, I issued a restraining order. I issued this piece of paper that says they couldn't do that. So they're covering their own ass, so to speak. And that's unfortunate that judges have that sort of incentive to do that. But the order, I think, before a restraining order should affect a person's gun rights, there needs to be a finding after a hearing, after the person has an opportunity to speak on their own behalf, that the person poses some credible threat of physical safety or harm to another person. And it doesn't sound like that has happened in this situation. Um, I'm not privy to all of the facts in the underlying case, but I don't think that blanket restraining orders, or rather that restraining orders should, as a whole, deprive people of their right to possess a firearm.
And now would be a great time to mention that although you are an attorney, we are not offering legal advice. And to, if any of this affects you or you think it may, to get advice from an attorney in your own jurisdiction.
Yes, exactly. Obviously, what we're talking about is our opinions and for educational purposes only. So, like Paul says, if this is something that applies to you, make sure you seek out legal advice in your jurisdiction.
Dan, you've been listening quietly. Any opinions on this, bud?
Yeah, well, I have I guess I'm questioning something. With this particular case you're talking about, it sounded like, okay, the case was filed before the Bruin decision. And then Alex said that there's a good chance that that the case could be changed or could be revisited or whatever. Um, we just had a whole bunch of cases that were running their way through the court get vacated. And we had I can't think of all of them. I can't remember all of them, but I know there was a Hawaii open carry case. There was a California so-called assault weapons. There was a whole bunch of cases, probably 4 or 5, and I did an article on them recently. But they were vacated because and sent down to the lower court, back down to the state. Because from what I understand, and Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, that now that the Bruin case has come out with these new determinations, those cases are kind of irrelevant because they have to meet the new Bruin parameters. So wouldn't even a small local case like this restraining order case be the same way?
Yeah, that's right. So the court, as you mentioned, granted review of several cases, vacated their opinions, and remanded them for further review in light of the Bruin decision and the standards set out in the Bruin decision. One of those was the Cantor decision that talked about felons in possession of firearms. The other was, as you mentioned, the Hawaii case and a number of others. And if my memory serves me correctly, yeah, these cases are referenced in footnote 4, I believe, in the opinion. If people are curious, I don't have the list in front of me, but footnote 4, I think, from the decision has a list of those cases that were GVR'd, granted review, vacated, and remanded for further proceedings. So this case out of California, as you were referring to, would be affected presumably by the Bruin case and the findings in the Bruin case. But the thing is that the petitioner wasn't challenging the law or trying to overturn the law in California at the time they filed the petition. But based on the findings in Bruin, they may now have a basis, or a better basis anyway, to challenge the law in California. And typically, if you want to amend a pleading or amend your complaint in a case, and a complaint is the pleading that initiates the case, it sets out the facts and the basis for the claim, in the law and the basis for the claim. And in light of the Bruin decision, they may have a claim that they didn't have before, or at least a better claim than they had when they filed the complaint. So even though the time requirements for amending a pleading may have passed, judges can still allow, at their discretion, amended pleadings beyond that time restraint if there's good cause or justice requires it. And I think that they can make a good argument that it does in light of the Bruin decision.
All right, moving on to our next. And Alex, we're going to be leaning heavy on you today because a lot of these are directly legal related. Our next story comes off ABA Journal, meaning the American Bar Association. Reading directly from the story, bill signed by Democratic governor on Tuesday, speaking of California, allows private citizens the state attorney general, and local governments to sue for damages or injunctive relief. If excuse me, this allows people to sue firearm manufacturers for almost anything, really. A 2005 federal law generally grants lawsuit immunity to gun makers and dealers for criminal use of their products. The bill signed by Newsom is based on an exemption in the federal law that allows for suits for violations of state laws concerning sales or marketing of guns, according to a press release by the governor's office. The new law also bans manufacture or sale of any gun or related product that is abnormally dangerous and likely to create an unreasonable risk of harm. The law creates an assumption that a product is abnormally dangerous when its features are more suitable for assault than for self-defense, when the product is designed or marketed in a way that promotes conversion into an illegal product, or when it is marketed to minors or others who are banned from accessing guns. That is where, and the next story tees off on this is where that is where I'm really worried here, because I am a 50-something male, and what I find good and attractive in advertising as a 50-something male is largely the same thing I found attractive in advertising as I did as a 17-something or 16-something male. My tastes haven't changed that much. Maybe it means I haven't grown up that much. But I don't like the fact that they're going for advertising and easily converted into something illegal. That's, again, very subjective. How easy is easy? Is a team of 3 and a week easy? Or is it one person and 25 seconds?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a conversation, Paul, previously. I don't remember if it was on a show or in some other context, but about the difficulty of converting an 80%, firearm, or actually technically not a firearm, but an 80% upper or lower into a firearm takes a great degree of skill and time and effort. So is something like that something that's easily converted into a firearm? I don't know. It seems like kind of an arbitrary standard, as with many of these other provisions in this proposal. Is somewhat arbitrary. What is appealing to children versus what's appealing to an older person? These things are difficult to assess and are clearly meant to be sort of a moving target to simply cast a wider net so that they can infringe on our rights more broadly. And this proposal, especially the part about making gun manufacturers subject to liability, is just for people who unlawfully use their products. It's just another example of how gun grabbers want to basically take away our rights by 1,000 cuts, death by 1,000 cuts, so to speak. And it's just insane to me that they think this is a legitimate proposal, because we don't do that for any other manufacturer, where someone who uses their product unlawfully somehow creates liability on behalf of the manufacturer. So we don't do that for car manufacturers. If somebody drives their cars drunk, this is just an attempt to bankrupt gun manufacturers as a backdoor way to take away the rights of law-abiding citizens from having access to firearms.
Right. Let me actually tee off on that. There was a case back about 6 months ago, right around Christmas time, where a convicted felon drove his Ford Escape through a Wisconsin Christmas parade, killed 6 people. We didn't go after Ford. And yet, this is very, very similar to that, because people are using people who are convicted felons who probably should be in jail anyway, and I can list example after example after example of these people being convicted felons out on early release or never prosecuted or given light slap on the wrist sentences. They are let out, they continue doing what they were doing before, and then they blame the gun. And then they say nobody should have these weapons of war.
You know, there was a lawsuit against Remington after Sandy Hook, and they tried doing the same thing, talking about the marketing of the guns as being the culprit here. But we do have the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, and it basically says that it protects firearm manufacturers. I'm reading a little summary here. Basically protects the firearms manufacturers and dealers from being held liable when crimes have been committed with their products. However, both manufacturers and dealers can still be held liable for damages resulting from defective products or breach of contract and criminal misconduct on behalf of the manufacturer. It protects the manufacturer from other people using the products and doing bad things. So I would hope that the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act holds up against this sort of thing. Alex, what do you think about that? Is it strong enough?
Oh, I lost Alex's audio.
Oh, okay.
Now we got you.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. So I think the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act is strong enough to withstand these, but the goal, I think, is to repeal the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, such that it wouldn't be in effect in place at all. Because, I mean, just like we see after every tragedy where innocent people are killed at the hands of a criminal, the target is always the tool and the law-abiding citizen. It's never the criminal. And the focus should be on how do we prevent criminals like this from committing these horrific acts, not how do we take useful defensive tools out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. And they're deflecting responsibility from the person who bears responsibility. And that's not the gun manufacturer. That's not the law-abiding citizen. That's not the tool itself. It's one and only the criminal who commits the horrific act. And that's the only person who bears responsibility, not any of these other tools or people.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see what we got next on the list. Well, we're going to stay right there in California, and we're going to talk about AB 2571, which is another bill that got signed into law this week. And reading this one off of nssf.org, prohibits firearm industry businesses, including gun and ammunition manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and ranges from advertising or marketing any firearm-related product as defined in a manner that is designed, intended, or reasonably appears to be attractive to minors. State authorities and the arbiters are determining if an advertisement is attractive to minors. Bearing Arms, Cam Edwards labeled the law as hogwash. I'm going to skip down a little bit. Under the new law, potentially offending ads would include caricatures that reasonably appear to be minors or cartoon characters used to promote firearm-related products. That could be the use of images or depictions of minors in marketing materials. The law specifically forbids ads in publications created for the purpose of reaching an audience that is predominantly composed of minors. The California's new law could impose a $25,000 minimum penalty for sponsoring any adult-supervised youth shooting event. That includes the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife Hunter education courses. Boy Scout target shooting merit badges could even be included. So in California, you can't even set up a marksmanship class for 17-year-olds anymore.
You know, this whole marketing to children thing is so subjective because you could, depending on who's determining this, anything could look like it's marketed to children. Watch any TV commercial that you see now for anything from fabric softener to cars. And if there's children in the ads, or there's always a way to make it to say that it's being marketed to children. I think Cam is exactly right. It's hogwash, but you got to give it to these Democrats. They're very creative in how they keep coming back and keep trying to find different angles to violate our rights. It's pretty amazing, but I think it's hogwash.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's hogwash as well. It's interesting, like you said, Paul, there toward the end, that the law would impose a $25,000 penalty for simply sponsoring any adult supervised youth shooting event. And listen, these youth shooting events are how young people are taught to handle
Right.
firearms safely and responsibly. And that's one of the best ways to teach people to defend themselves and to handle these tools responsibly and safely. And so
Yeah.
they're taking away effectively funding for these sorts of gun safety measures. If they're really for gun safety, they're making a great effort to undermine it. So to me, that's just absurd. The other thing, and the article from the NSSF references Professor Eugene Volokh, who I think has a blog. I think it's called the Volokh Conspiracy on Reason magazine. That's
Exactly
very
right.
good, and he writes a lot about the First Amendment. Is very good. So if you're interested in what he has to say on First Amendment issues, check that out for sure. But he points out that he spoke out in opposition to the bill. He said, first of all, it violates protected political speech, not just commercial advertising under the First Amendment. And even as to commercial advertising, it's vague. What does it mean to be appealing to children, like we talked about earlier, as opposed to adults? Again, this bill is casting a wide net to try to minimize and undermine gun rights as much as possible.
You know what? I would like to comment on what Alex brought up. Alex brought up a thought here that, trying to prevent sponsoring of firearms training courses for young people, that's part of the goal, I would think. And I've talked about this before. It would appear to me that they're trying to do everything they can to eliminate young people taking up firearms and learning about firearms and getting firearms education, because I think what they're trying to do is build the next generation of Americans to be either non-gun owners or anti-gunners. And I think if they can cut it off at this generation, or start weaning off the parents being able to teach their kids firearms, or in this case in Boy Scouts or wherever, I think their long game is that we have a future of non-gun owners. So again, this plays right into their overall long-term anti-gun plan.
Yeah, and Dan, I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I would take it even a step further. It's not only to prevent people from being future gun owners, it's to prevent people from being taking personal responsibility. It's about
Yeah.
breeding a generation that's dependent on the government, not just for
Oh,
personal
absolutely.
protection, but for lots of arenas. And by
Absolutely.
taking away the sort of education, you're breeding a generation that looks to the government for everything, including personal protection. And I think
Yeah.
that's the long game here. It's about expanding the power and authority of government and taking away personal responsibility.
Well, Alex, you nailed it, because I talk about this a lot on radio and stuff. And when we're talking about just look at the welfare system. I mean, right now we're talking about 3 or 4 generations deep of what families in welfare, and that's just crazy. But what that does exactly what you're saying. It makes people dependent on government. In this case, with guns, people are going to be dependent on government or police departments for their safety because they won't be able to protect themselves. And then we can look at the climate change nonsense. People are going to be dependent on government for transportation at some point. Every way that these communists want, or any way that they can think of to make the people dependent, they're doing it. And the problem is we're not talking about it enough. But thanks for bringing that up. It's a good point.
Let's go ahead and move on to, we got two more stories we're going to get to, and at this pace we're going, we got just about enough time to get to them both. Lauren Boebert, who is honestly a personal hero of mine, I got to interview her once. I've met her in person once. Lauren Boebert has introduced a bill, and I'm getting this one off of Bearing Arms, is a Tom Knighton story, that would completely repeal the gun control legislation that Joe Biden just signed into law. The Boebert's bill, which stretches barely beyond one page, is titled the Shall Not Be Infringed Act. What it does, very simply, is completely repeal the so-called Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. The legislation sailed through Congress early this summer, promoting red flag laws using federal funds, and also it banned 18 to 21-year-olds from buying rifles, and expanded them and it expanded background checks on them and other things. Similar to the federal assault weapons ban, it's got absolutely zero chance, simply because Boebert is in the House, and the Democrats control the House. So while the assault weapons ban may clear the House, this has absolutely zero chance until January of next year, assuming she gets reelected, and I believe she will. She's very popular in her district, and I think she's going to sail through reelection. But until January 2023, I don't think this has any chance at all in the House. It would have to clear a very strongly democratically controlled House. But good on her for making the effort. Dan, I'm going to go to you first because I've been leaning on Alex really hard.
Well, I don't know a heck of a lot about that particular one, but I do know Lauren Boebert is just a fantastic. I mean, she is. If we had more of her, we would be in a pretty good place. I just love her. Her spirit and her patriotism. So just a kind of hats off to Lauren.
Yeah, and Paul, to your point too. I mean, obviously this has no chance, but it is refreshing and reassuring to know that there are people in Congress who do support individual liberty and will stand up for our rights, and that means when they don't have a fighting chance, and when we do, and we need more people like her, like you said, Dan. So hats off to her, and hopefully she can make some progress and gain more allies in Congress going forward.
I want to get a comment in here real quick. Pete over at Gun Websites, who's been unusually quiet today. If they can say that the number of gun deaths is a reason to remove rights and property, then they focus on traffic deaths. They will have precedent to say cars should be regulated and then banned.
Well, I think they're trying to ban cars just in a different way.
I think they're trying to, but they're going to move eventually to ban gasoline engine cars, and then they're going to create a restriction. I mean, trust me, folks. This is not a tinfoil hat. This is a regular cloth hat. But I could easily see banning, and California has done this. I think it's 2030 is the end of gasoline-powered engines in California. And then all of a sudden, there's going to be an electricity shortage. Just mark my words.
Yeah. Well, they'll still have public transportation. And that's the thing that worries me, is that I think, there's going to be this push for public transportation. That may be why California was trying to, I don't know too much about that split rail train setup that Newsom was trying to push, but it's all about public transportation. It's all about public housing. If you notice, a lot of the apartment developments now they're packing as many people as they can into these complexes, and what they do is they're nice places, but they also have restaurants and bars and stores all within the complex. And I think it's all part of the plan. It's a way of taking ownership from people. No, they won't own a car, they won't own a house, and basically making people dependent, like Alex was talking about earlier. And that's just part of the plan. I can see it. If we allow things to continue down this path, I can see public transportation in the near future. I think that electric vehicles, I don't know that that's really what they want. I think they want public transportation.
Yeah, and here's the other thing too is that uh, gun control advocates see cars as useful because people need them to go to and from their job and to pay tax. Their job's essential to pay taxes, which is, the funding they need to have more power, etc. Whereas they don't see our right to self-defense as a fundamental right. They don't see firearms as useful, largely out of ignorance. And so while I agree they are trying to take cars away as well, at least in a different way. Um, I think it largely stems from the fact that they don't see firearms as useful, and um, they do see cars as useful. So I think that's part of it as well. They simply don't recognize the right to self defense and the right to possess and carry firearms as an extension of that right.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to our last story. This one off of Reuters. A federal judge Thursday appeared poised to allow a San Jose, California city ordinance requiring gun owners to purchase insurance to take effect, though she expressed strong misgivings about another part of the law requiring gun owners to pay a fee to a newly created anti-gun violence nonprofit. U.S. District Judge Beth Labson Freeman in San Jose said at a video conference hearing that she did not believe the ordinance implicated the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution because it did not allow the city to enforce it by seizing guns, and so, excuse me, and so is not inclined to grant a request from the National Association of Gun Rights for a preliminary injunction blocking it. I all laws that are passed are enforced with a gun, because eventually, if you parking, if you violate a parking law, you're going to get a ticket. If you get enough of them, you're going to get a warrant for your arrest. When they come to arrest you for that warrant, they're going to do it with an officer with a gun on his hip. If you resist that officer, you're going to get shot. All laws, in my opinion, are backed at the point of a gun. That's where I disagree with this judge on this one. Either one of you want to comment on this?
Well, I'll just comment briefly. Oh, go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
No, you first, Dan.
Well, I would agree. I just want to agree with you, Paul, on that. All laws are backed by guns, and I think what happens is our political, I don't want to. The people we employ politically, they know that, and they understand that they have the leverage, and they want to keep the leverage, and the leverage is guns. And I'm working on an article right now for AmmoLand. I'm talking a lot about that. The reason they want gun control is because they want to control the people. They understand the power and the leverage that guns bring them, and they also understand the power and leverage that guns bring us. So it's a very interesting thing. But so I just wanted to say I agree with you. They understand the power of guns, and they just don't want the people to have them.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree that the laws ultimately have to be enforced at the point of a gun if push comes to shove. Um, and the government knows that an armed citizenry is not a citizenry of subjects. and it's a citizenry that can hold the government accountable. In fact, there's a great book by Stephen Holbrook, who he's a historian, and he wrote a book called Gun Control in the Third Reich, which just talks a lot about the efforts of a lot of tyrannical regimes to disarm their citizenry. So that's where a lot of the motivation comes from, is this desire of the government to expand power, and one of the ways to do that is to have a monopoly on violence. And if the government is the only entity that has the ability to exert violence, then that obviously is a government with unlimited control, and that's not what we want. Obviously, this provision requiring people to obtain liability insurance is just a small step in that direction, but it is a step in that direction, and it's a burden on the exercise of the people's right to keep and bear arms. Luckily, I think provisions like these will be challenged, and is it something that would stand up to the text, history, and tradition analysis that the Supreme Court has given us in Bruin?
And I want
Let
to,
me just comment real quick on the liability insurance.
Yeah.
Just real quick, Paul. If liability insurance was required for gun ownership, you can bet that there would be one company monopolizing. It's already hard enough to get liability insurance for gun shows and even events where you're just talking about the Second Amendment. I know because I was involved in one. And getting insurance, I think it was Lloyd's of London, was pretty much the only place to get the insurance to hold the event. Very expensive. You can imagine the price, the cost of concealed carry insurance if that was federal law. So and not only that, but what happens when if your insurance lapses in your car? Who gets notified? DMV, right? So what would happen if your handgun insurance lapsed? Who would get notified, and what would happen to your ability then to be a gun owner, or then to carry a gun in public with your concealed carry permit? It's just a horrible idea, and it would really be a great way for them to control lawful citizens' guns.
well, and I am not an attorney, but I want to draw a link to and I do not have the case in front of me, but I do know at the end of the Civil War that every male citizen got the right to vote. People in the South didn't like the fact that poor blacks, and they were universally poor because they just got their freedom, got the right to vote. So they created a poll tax. It wasn't huge. For a white Southern male, it wasn't a big deal. For a poor Southern male, it was a huge stinking deal. That went through court. Eventually, it got shot down because there shouldn't be a tax on a basic freedom. I believe this is going to eventually go through the same process, and I think it's going to get struck down when it gets high enough, in meaning to the Supreme Court and hopefully Justice Thomas. When it gets high enough, I think it's going to get struck down the same way. This is nothing other than a poll tax. Although it's small, it will get bigger. Nothing but a poll tax for gun owners.
Yeah, I'd say it's even more than that, Paul, because the right to vote is a civic right, and obviously it's a right that we uphold in the United States and put on a pedestal. But the right to self-defense is an individual right. It's a natural right. It's a right that existed government and the Constitution in the United States. The right to vote is only a right by virtue of being a citizen of the United States and a citizen of a government. So it's a civic right, which is an important right, but I think a lesser right than an individual right that preexists, a natural right that preexists government.
All right. Well, we are, and I knew this is going to happen. We are just about out of time. As we go out, I want to, Dan, if you would, talk about the Loaded Mic. Also talk about Good Gun, Bad Guy, and where they can get your books, where they can listen to your radio show, man.
Yep. Good Gun, Bad Guy is my book series. It's right in back of me. You can see it over my shoulder. It's a 3-book series. Talks about the anti-gun mindset. It gets into the media's involvement in the anti-gun narrative, and then it gets into the third book gets into the politics behind the gun grab. GoodGunBadGuy.com. And also the Loaded Mic is my web show. It's primarily a Second Amendment show, but we get into politics of the day and a lot of fun. My son Danny Wass Jr. produces the show up here in upstate New York, and you can catch that at loadedmic.com. Loaded Mic like microphone, M-I-C, loadedmic.com, and goodgunbadguy.com.
Alex, is there anything you'd like to promote on our way out the door, bud?
Yeah, sure. So I don't have a podcast or a book to promote or anything, but obviously I have a firm here in Indiana with my dad, and we do firearms related issues. We handle firearms related issues. So if folks in Indiana have an issue related to firearms law or training, we also have a firearms training business here, O2 Gun Group. You can find our website, ooleylaw.com or o2gungroup.com. So if you've got any questions about training or a legal issue, give us a shout.
All right, very cool. On my end, I'd like to thank everybody for watching. I'd like to encourage you to come back Monday through Friday next week, 5 p.m. Central Time. We'll continue discussing the news of the day. And thanks, everybody, for watching today. Everybody who's watched live, thanks you to all you podcast listeners. And especially thank you, everybody who's contributed by commenting. It really does make the show a lot easier when you get involved. So until next time, everybody, thanks again, and we'll see you then.